Before the first ship ever dared to cut across open water, before the first sailor looked up at the stars and dared to call them a map, the ocean was already ancient. It had been breathing long before the gods thought to name it, long before any mortal tongue could shape a word for its depths, and in those depths, older than memory itself, something enormous had been sleeping. This is the story of the Kraken. Not the creature of sailors' nightmares, not the beast of hushed warnings passed between fishermen over dying fires. This is the true story, the one that lives beneath all other stories, the one the sea itself remembers when the tides pull back and the water grows very, very still. Listen carefully. The ocean does not tell this tale twice. In the age before ages, when the world was still deciding what shape it wanted to wear, the great cosmic architects divided existence into 3 realms. The sky was given to those who burned, the beings of light and storm who loved to be seen and worshipped. The earth was given to those who grew, the patient gods of soil and stone who measured time in mountains. But the sea, that vast and restless third of everything, was given to no single power. The sea was too large, too old, too proud to be owned, and so the ocean became a kingdom of argument. 3 great divine families claimed dominion over its waters. The titans of the deep, ancient beyond reckoning, believed the ocean belonged to them by right of age alone, for they had swum its currents before the younger gods had even opened their eyes. The storm lords, those magnificent and terrible beings who commanded both sky and wave, insisted that wherever wind touched water, their authority extended downward into the dark. And the weavers of fate, those strange and silent goddesses who spun the threads of every living thing's destiny, argued simply that the ocean belonged to them because everything did in the end. For countless ages, these 3 powers circled one another like storm systems, each too proud to yield, each too cautious to strike. The mortals who lived along the coasts built their temples to all 3, hedging their devotion the way a wise merchant hedges his trade, never committing entirely to one patron, never entirely abandoning another. But the ocean, as it always does, was keeping its own counsel. Deep beneath the surface, in a trench so profound that light had never once touched its floor, something stirred, not a new thing, not a created thing. The Kraken was older than the gods who argued over the sea's ownership. It was, in the truest sense, a remnant, a living piece of the world's first dream, from the time before order, before light, before the separation of things into categories and names. The Kraken was what the ocean had been before anyone tried to understand it. It was vast. To say it was large would be like saying the sky is somewhat tall. Its body was a continent in motion, its arms reaching for distances that would take a mortal ship 3 days to sail. Its eyes, when they opened, were the size of great lakes, and they held within them a color that had no name because no mortal had ever survived long enough to describe it. It did not think the way gods think, with ambition and desire and wounded pride. It thought the way the deep ocean thinks, in pressures and currents and the slow turning of geological time. For ages beyond counting, it had simply been sleeping, breathing, existing as a fact of the universe the way darkness exists, not as an absence of something, but as a presence in its own right. But then came the age of the great sailors. They were a people from a land of red cliffs and olive trees, a civilization that had built its entire identity around the sea. They called themselves the Thalassari, the children of the wave, and they were by any measure magnificent. Their ships were works of art and engineering combined, their hulls shaped like the bodies of dolphins, their sails dyed in colors that caught the light like living things. They had mapped every coastline within 3 weeks' sailing of their home harbors. They had established trade routes that stretched to the edges of the known world. They had, in their pride and their brilliance, begun to believe that the ocean was theirs, not in the way the gods believed it. The Thalassari did not claim divine authority. They claimed something more dangerous. They claimed mastery. Their greatest navigator was a woman named Thessaly. She had been born during a storm so violent that the midwife had declared it an omen, though she had wisely declined to specify whether it was a good one or a terrible one. Thessaly had grown up with salt in her hair and stars in her eyes, and she could read the ocean the way other people read faces, seeing in its moods and movements a language that spoke directly to some deep part of her. She had sailed routes no one else had dared attempt. She had brought her ships home through conditions that should have been fatal. She was, by universal agreement among her people, the greatest sailor who had ever lived. And that, as any student of mythology will tell you, is precisely the kind of distinction that attracts divine attention. The three great powers who argued over the ocean had been watching the Thalassari for some time. The Storm Lords admired their boldness and resented their success in equal measure. The Titans of the Deep regarded them with the distant contempt of the ancient for the young. But the Weavers of Fate had been watching Thessaly specifically, and what they saw in the threads of her destiny made them pause their eternal spinning and look at one another with expressions that, on a mortal face, might have been called concern. Her thread was tangled with something enormous, something that had no thread of its own because it predated the loom. The crisis began, as so many crises do, with an act of extraordinary hubris committed by someone with the very best intentions. The High Council of the Thalassari, flush with decades of successful voyages and growing wealth, decided to commission the greatest expedition in their history. They would sail to the edge of the mapped world and beyond it. They would find the mythical Sunken Isles, a chain of islands said to lie at the very center of the ocean, where the water was warm as bathwater and the fish practically leaked into the nets. More than that, they would plant their banner at the heart of the sea and declare, formally and permanently, that the ocean belonged to civilization, to human endeavor, to the magnificent project of mortal understanding. They asked Thessaly to lead the expedition. She accepted because she was Thessaly, and Thessaly did not refuse a challenge. But she did something the council had not expected. She went first to the three great temples on the cliff above the harbor, the one built of white stone for the Storm Lords, the one built of black basalt for the Titans of the Deep, and the one built of no stone at all, just living wood, for the Weavers of Fate. She made offerings at all three. She asked for blessing from all three. What she received was something more complicated. From the Storm Lords she received a gift of wind, a small carved shell that, when held to the lips and blown, would summon a favorable breeze from any direction. It was a generous gift, and the Storm Lord who gave it smiled with all the warmth of a summer sky. But there was something in that smile that Thessaly, for all her perceptiveness, did not quite catch. An anticipation, a watching quality. From the Titans of the Deep, she received nothing visible, just a cold sensation that passed through her when she stood at their altar, and a voice like water moving over stone that said simply, "We know where you are going. We have always known." She left that temple quickly, unsettled in a way she could not name. From the Weavers of Fate, she received the strangest gift of all. One of the three sisters, the youngest, who appeared as an old woman with fingers stained permanently dark from handling so many threads, pressed into Thessaly's palm a single knot of cord, not a knot that could be untied, but a knot that was itself the point, a complex, beautiful, impossible tangle that seemed to shift and change when you looked at it directly. "When you reach the center," the weaver said, "you will have a choice. Remember that the knot is not a problem to be solved. It is a truth to be understood." Thessaly had spent 3 days puzzling over those words before she gave up and set sail. The fleet was magnificent. 12 ships, the finest the Thalassari had ever built, each one crewed by the most skilled sailors in the civilization, each one carrying provisions for 6 months, instruments of navigation more precise than any previously made, and enough trade goods to establish relationships with whatever peoples they might encounter. The harbor was filled with cheering crowds when they departed. Children threw flowers into the water. Elders wept with pride. The whole city turned out to watch their greatest navigator lead their greatest fleet into the horizon. No one noticed the stillness that fell over the deep water just beyond the harbor mouth. No one saw the way the sea, for just a moment, seemed to hold its breath. For the first month, the voyage was everything the council had hoped it would be. The shell gift from the Storm Lords proved its worth, providing favorable winds whenever the natural breezes faltered. The fleet made extraordinary time, covering distances in weeks that should have taken months. Thessaly's navigational skill kept them on course through 3 separate storms that would have scattered a lesser fleet. The crew's morale was high. The sky was clear more often than not. Fish were plentiful. The sunken isles, according to Thessaly's calculations, were no more than 3 weeks ahead. And then, on the 33rd day, the ocean changed. It was subtle at first. A deepening of the color, from the familiar blue-green of the open sea to something darker, more saturated, almost purple in certain lights. A change in the feel of the water when they dipped their hands over the side, cooler somehow, with a weight to it that normal seawater did not possess. The fish disappeared. Not gradually, not in the way fish disappear when a storm is coming, but all at once, between 1 hour and the next, as if something below had simply called them away. Thessaly stood at the prow of her flagship and looked at the water and felt, for the first time in her sailing life, that the ocean was looking back. She was right. The first sign was a wave that came from the wrong direction. The wind was from the north, and the wave should have been running south, but this wave came from below, a long, slow swell that lifted all 12 ships simultaneously and set them down again with a gentleness that was somehow more frightening than violence would have been. It was the gentleness of something enormous that was trying not to break what it was touching. The second sign was the color. The water around the fleet began to glow, faintly at first, then with increasing intensity, a deep bioluminescent light that pulsed in a rhythm that several of the sailors, independently and without conferring, described later as resembling a heartbeat. The third sign was the arm. It rose from the water off the port side of the third ship in the fleet, and it rose slowly, the way a question is asked slowly when the asker already knows the answer will be difficult. It was not attacking. It was not reaching for the ships. It simply rose and kept rising until its tip was level with the top of the mast, and the sailors on that ship stood frozen in the kind of silence that happens when the mind is presented with something it does not have a category for. The arm was covered in circles, each one large enough for a man to stand inside, and each one pulsed with that same slow, deep light. It hung in the air for a long moment, and then, with the same terrible gentleness, it lowered itself back into the water without making a sound. Thessaly had watched all of this from her position at the prow. Her hands were gripping the rail hard enough to whiten her knuckles, but her face was calm. She had spent 30 years training herself to project calm in crisis, because she knew that a crew takes its emotional cues from its captain, and a panicking crew is a dead crew. She looked at the water where the arm had disappeared, and she thought, with extraordinary clarity, that everything she had understood about the ocean had just been revealed as a child's drawing of a thing, not the thing itself. She reached into the pouch at her belt and took out the knotted cord the Weaver of Fate had given her. The knot seemed different now. The same, but different. The way a word seems different when you finally understand what it means. The Storm Lords chose this moment to act. The sky, which had been clear, went dark in the span of 10 breaths. Not the natural darkness of clouds gathering, but the sudden, deliberate darkness of a power asserting itself, the way a hand covers a candle. The wind that came with it was not the gentle, favorable wind of the gifted shell. This was something older and angrier, a wind with intention behind it, and its intention was to drive the fleet forward, deeper into the water above the Kraken's resting place. Because the Storm Lords had made a calculation. They had decided that the Thalassary's fleet, sailing boldly into the Kraken's territory, might accomplish what the gods themselves had been unable to do for ages. It might wake the ancient thing fully, draw it to the surface, and in the confrontation that followed, the Storm Lords could intervene, demonstrate their power over even the most ancient force in the ocean, and settle once and for all the question of who ruled the sea. They had not, in their divine cleverness, considered what the Kraken might do once it was fully awake. Thessaly felt the wind change and understood, with the intuition of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the ocean's moods, that this was not natural. She looked up at the sky and saw, in the pattern of the clouds, something that looked almost like intention. She looked down at the water and saw the glow intensifying. She was caught between two forces that could destroy her fleet without effort, and she had a knotted cord in her hand and 33 days of sailing between her and home. She thought about the weaver's words. The knot is not a problem to be solved. It is a truth to be understood. She looked at the knot. She looked at the water. She looked at the sky. And then she did something that no one, not her crew, not the gods, not the Kraken itself, had anticipated. She put down the shell that the Storm Lords had given her. She set it carefully on the rail of the ship where the wind could find it. And then she leaned over the side of the ship and held the knotted cord out over the glowing water and let it go. The cord fell. It hit the water and floated for a moment, that impossible knot catching the bioluminescent light and scattering it in patterns that seemed to mean something, though no mortal could have said what. Then it began to sink slowly, descending into the deep water with a kind of purpose. Below, something enormous opened its eyes. What happened next is told differently in different traditions. Some say the Kraken rose fully to the surface, and the sight of it drove every sailor temporarily beyond the reach of language. Some say it never fully surfaced, that only its arms came up, surrounding the fleet in a circle of impossible gentleness, each arm a living wall between the ships and the storm. The Storm Lords were building. Some say that Thessaly herself was lifted from her ship by one of those vast arms and held, briefly, in a grip that could have crushed a mountain, and that during those moments she heard, or felt, or somehow received, the Kraken's communication. What all the traditions agree on is the result. The storm. Not gradually, not the way storms naturally dissipate, but all at once, the clouds pulling back like a curtain, the wind dropping to nothing, the sea going flat and glassy and still. And in that stillness, in that profound and absolute quiet, the three divine families who had argued over the ocean for ages felt something they had not felt in longer than memory. They felt the ocean itself take a position. The Kraken was not a weapon. It was not a tool. It was not a monster to be woken and aimed at one's enemies. It was the ocean's own memory of itself from before the time of gods and arguments and claimed dominions. And in rising, even partially, even briefly, it had reminded every power in the cosmos of something they had all been carefully forgetting. The ocean does not belong to anyone. The ocean belongs to itself. The Thalassari fleet sat in that impossible calm for what felt like a very long time. The glow beneath the water faded slowly, like a fire banking down to coals. The arms, if they had truly been there, withdrew. The water returned to its normal color. The fish came back. A natural, gentle wind rose from the west and filled the sails. Thessaly stood at the prow of her flagship and looked at the place where the knotted cord had disappeared into the water and felt the particular kind of peace that comes not from resolution but from understanding. The weaver had been right. The knot was not a problem. It was a truth. The truth was this: some things are too ancient and too large to be owned, and the wisdom of mortals lies not in conquering such things, but in learning to sail alongside them. She turned the fleet around. The council was not pleased when the fleet returned without reaching the sunken isles. There were long, difficult meetings. Questions were asked about the worth of the expedition, the loss of the Storm Lord's gift, the strange reports from 36 sailors about arms and lights, and a stillness that felt like judgment. Thessaly answered every question honestly and completely, and she was not believed by the people who needed to not believe her, and was believed completely by the people who mattered. She spent the rest of her life sailing, but differently. She taught her students that the ocean was not a road to be traveled, or a resource to be harvested, or a territory to be claimed. It was a living thing with its own ancient purposes, and the role of the sailor was not to conquer it, but to enter into conversation with it, to ask permission with every voyage and give thanks with every safe return. The Thalassari, over the generations that followed, became the greatest navigators the world had ever known, not because they mastered the sea, but because they learned to listen to it. And in the depths, in that lightless trench where no measurement could reach, the Kraken settled back into its ancient sleep. It had been awake for such a brief time, by its reckoning. Barely a moment. Barely a breath. But in that moment, it had done what it had always done, not as a monster, not as a weapon, but as the ocean's oldest truth. It had reminded the world that some things are beyond dominion. The three divine families never fully resolved their argument over who owned the sea. They still haven't. On days when the storm rolls in without warning, that is, the storm lords pressing their claim. On days when the water is dark and cold and seems to pull at the hull of a ship with something like intention, that is the titans of the deep asserting their ancient right. On days when the sea is perfectly calm and a sailor feels, inexplicably, that the voyage is going exactly as it was always meant to go, that is the weavers of fate running their invisible threads through the water. But on those rare and extraordinary days when the ocean goes, a color that has no name, when the water seems to breathe in a rhythm that matches nothing natural, when every sailor on every ship feels simultaneously very small and very safe, as if something vast and old and beyond all argument has turned its attention briefly toward the surface and found the little vessels there, neither threatening nor worthy of destruction, just present, just alive, just sailing, those days belong to no god at all. Those days belong to the deep. The Kraken does not sleep as mortals sleep, with dreams and restlessness and the occasional surfacing into wakefulness. It sleeps as the ocean floor sleeps, as geological time sleeps, as the darkness at the bottom of the world sleeps, which is to say, it is never entirely absent, never entirely present, always there in the way that depth is always there, waiting beneath whatever surface you think you understand. Sailors who have been on the water long enough learn to feel it, not as fear, though fear is part of it, as a kind of vertigo, a sudden awareness of how much lies beneath the part of the ocean they can see. The water they sail on is a thin skin over an incomprehensible darkness, and in that darkness, something older than the gods breathes in and breathes out, and the tides are its breath, and the deep currents are its dreaming, and the strange and inexplicable calms that fall over the water sometimes for no meteorological reason in the middle of the widest and most open stretches of sea. Those are the moments when it turns, slowly, in its sleep, and the whole ocean turns with it. This is why sailors have always spoken of the sea with a respect that borders on reverence, and why the best of them have always understood, in some wordless and inarticulate way, that the ocean's mercy is not something you earn by being strong or skilled or brave, it is something you receive by being humble, by remembering every time you leave the harbor that you are a guest in a house whose owner predates everything you know and whose rules were written before the first word was ever spoken. Thessaly knew this. She passed it on to her students, who passed it on to theirs, and somewhere in that long chain of transmission, the knowledge became the thing it always was, a myth, a story, a legend told around fires and in harbor taverns and in the quiet moments before a voyage when a sailor looks at the water and feels, for just a moment, the full weight of what they are about to enter. The Kraken is real in the way that all true things are real, not because you can measure it or map it or prove it with instruments, but because the sea itself confirms it, in its moods and its silences and its sudden inexplicable decisions to be kind. It is still down there. It has always been down there. And on the days when the water goes that nameless color and the tides breathe in a rhythm that matches nothing in any natural record, it is remembering, briefly, what it felt like to open its eyes. What it felt like to hold a fleet of tiny ships in the circle of its arms and feel, in the wood of their hulls and the fear of their crews and the fear of their crews and the fierce fragile hope of their navigator, the particular beauty of mortal things that know they are small and sail anyway. That, perhaps, is why it lets them pass. Not because they are powerful enough to face it, not because the gods protect them, but because something in the Kraken, something as old as the ocean and as deep as the trench it sleeps in, recognizes in the act of sailing, in the human insistence on crossing water that could swallow them without a trace, a kind of courage that even the most ancient thing in the world finds worth preserving. The sea keeps its secrets. But it keeps its secrets. but it keeps its secrets. And this one, the story of the Kraken and the navigator and the knotted cord that fell into the deep water and never came back up. This one, the ocean tells itself on quiet nights when the stars are out and the surface is still, and somewhere far below the reach of light, something enormous breathes in and breathes out, and the tide turns, and the world remembers how small it is, and how vast, and how full of wonders that no one has yet found the right words to describe. If this story stirred something in you, that feeling of standing at the edge of something ancient and enormous and true, then you already understand what mythology is for. It is not history. It is not fantasy. It is the way we remember what we know but cannot say. Leave a comment below and tell us which part of the Kraken story stayed with you, because the best conversations about these ancient tales happen in the space between the story and the listener. Subscribe if you want to keep sailing into these deep waters together, because there are more stories where this one came from, older than memory, stranger than dreams, and every one of them is waiting to be told.